In 1951, Mohammad Mossadegh tried to end the British domination of Iran. Mossadegh nationalized Iranian oil, which had been monopolized by a single British company for more than 40 years. For him, this nationalization was essential to establish a free and independent Iran.
روز به روز در واقع دولت با ملت یکی‌تر میشه. این سابقه نداشت. همین حالش هم نداره، اون موقع هم نداشت.
Mossadegh also became the symbol of third world nationalism, and his influence went far beyond his own country.
پایه استقلال ملل افریقایی و بعضی از ملل آسیایی همین نسبت ملی ایران بوده.
Mossadegh's irreverence inspired love, hate, and ridicule, as well as respect among his allies and his enemies.
One did have this laugh about him, but from his bed, he would make some very powerful speeches.
Mossadegh had to fight against a virtual alliance of foreign and domestic enemies. They undermined him in a struggle for power and control of oil.
مصدق اصلاً در کارنامه سیاسی شعار دادن و عوام فریبی حرف اولو میزد.
نزدیکترین یاران مصدق در لحظات حساس رهاش کردند.
More than 5 decades later, it is impossible to understand Iran without understanding Mossadegh's victories and failures. His myth still influences life and politics in Iran today. Mohammad Mossadegh became Prime Minister on the 28th of April 1951. Within a few months, his government took over the assets of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. The company is currently known as BP, British Petroleum. The British government owned 51% of the oil company. The British government's revenue from Iranian oil was double the amount of the Iranian government's. The oil company had built Iran's oil industry from scratch in exchange for total control over exploration and sale of the oil. It had invested millions of pounds in building infrastructure, refineries, roads, and ports. But the way they protected their interests created resentment in the oil-rich province of Khuzestan.
بعض اینجوری بود که اگه کسی می‌خواست یه مغازه آهنگری ساده ها تأسیس کنه، مقامات دولتی ایران کاری نبودن. اونا زود موافقت میکردن. شرکت نفت باید موافقت میکرد و شرکت نفت خیلی بالا پایین میکرد، به اصطلاح گزینش میکرد. این درست سرزمین خوزستان مستعمره انگلستان.
After months of failed negotiations, Mossadegh's officials took control of the refinery in Abadan on the 19th of June 1951. They were hailed as heroes by the majority of the Iranian refinery workers. Mossadegh asked the Iranian employees to avoid any action that might provoke the British. He also offered to compensate the oil company for its confiscated property. The British refused all offers. Mossadegh had to go. After the nationalization, Mossadegh became a hate figure in Great Britain. In 1951, the British Empire was rapidly shrinking and didn't want to let go of one of its most important assets. The British reacted immediately to the news of the nationalization. The British government took legal action against Mossadegh at the International Court of Justice. The court asked Iran to cease the nationalization process until it reached a decision. Mossadegh ignored the court's decision and insisted that Iran's argument was with a British company and not the government. The British Navy blockaded Iran's oil. Several tankers were stopped in the Persian Gulf. British paratroopers were ready to invade Iran.
The men under the fighting command of Brigadier Darling, by merely being alerted, have to some extent calmed down the extremists in Persia. If the paratroops do go there, their role will be to protect our own people, not to intimidate the Persians.
All major international oil companies joined the boycott of Iran. They didn't want Mossadegh's nationalization to become a model for other countries to follow. From the moment Iran nationalized its oil, it couldn't sell it. While the British government was going through international diplomatic channels, British diplomats in Tehran began a covert operation to overthrow Mossadegh. Sam Fall was the only Persian-speaking diplomat at the British Embassy in Tehran. By 1951, Sam Fall and his family had spent 2 years in Iran. He, his wife, and 3 children had many friends and enjoyed their diplomatic lifestyle. He liked the company of Iranians, but there was something about them which bothered him.
Generally speaking, I would say the Iranians are a very attractive people, not in the Western sense trustworthy.
What do you mean exactly, much less trustworthy?
But it's trustworthy. Well, I mean, you couldn't rely on them. But we did succeed. We were lucky in finding trustworthy Iranians.
The people Sam Fall could trust were part of a secret network of agents and allies who were helping the British to overthrow Mossadegh. The British initially started a propaganda campaign against him. On the 21st of July 1951, a Foreign Office official in London thanked the British ambassador in Iran for his suggestions regarding the propaganda on BBC Persian radio.
The BBC had already made most of the points which you listed, but they were very glad to have an indication from you of what was likely to be most effective, and will arrange their programmes accordingly. We should also avoid attacks on the ruling classes, since it seems probable that we may want to deal with a government drawn from those classes should Mossadegh fall. We shall be very grateful for your comments on the propaganda line we have proposed.
Mossadegh confounded the British. They had never before needed to go to such lengths to fight an Iranian leader. Born in 1882, Mossadegh came from a family of landowners, and his mother was related to the Iranian royal dynasty of the time, the Qajars. He received a doctorate in law from the University of Neuchâtel in Switzerland. This Western education gave him an astute understanding of the British psychological warfare against him. From early on, he portrayed Iran as a small country being bullied by a superpower. The British accused him of being a populist and demagogue. Despite his popularity, one question puzzled Iranians and foreigners alike. Why did Mossadegh receive dignitaries in his pajamas?
چون در جوانی که در خارج بود، در فرانسه بود، خیلی بهش بد گذشته بود و خیلی ناراحتی کشیده بود، همیشه در حال مواظب سلامتش بود. خیلی روی این موضوع چیز داشت، وسواسی، در حد وسواس رو سلامتش خیلی مواظب بود و راحت تر بود که توی تخت خواب پذیرایی بکنه از سایرین، ولی بیماری نداشت، نه.
The unsatisfactory reasons given for Mossadegh's conduct enabled his Iranian and foreign critics to create an image of him as a histrionic old man.
There was nothing stupid in him. This was an act he put on to show that I'm old and I'm weak, but still I'm strong in mind and I'm still fighting for Iran, even though I have to lie down. It was an act.
When Mossadegh became prime minister in 1951, the Cold War was the new world order. Stalin's Soviet Union had taken over most countries in Eastern Europe. The American and British troops were fighting against the communists in Korea. But this was also the dawn of the nuclear age. The Soviet Union had successfully tested 3 atom bombs. The Americans and the British were terrified that any conflict with the Soviets could become a nuclear holocaust. Iran, a strategic ally of the West, had already been threatened by Stalin. After the Second World War in 1945, the Soviet Union had tried to create a puppet government in the Iranian province of Azerbaijan. In their arguments against Mossadegh, the British claimed that his government would inevitably lead to a communist takeover of Iran.
He was not acceptable because he would not have been able to control the communists. As himself, he was a nice guy. There was a lot about him that was good. He was a pure Iranian nationalist.
Communism was also an internal threat in Iran. Even though it was banned in 1949, the Communist Party was the largest and most organized political group in the country, and it openly proclaimed its allegiance to the Soviet Union.
حزب توده ایران نظیر کلیه احزاب کمونیست جهان حزب کمونیست اتحاد شوروی رو حزب برادر و حزب بزرگ برادر تلقی می‌کرد.
Despite British claims, the communists were Mossadegh's most vociferous enemies. A decade earlier, as a parliamentarian, Mossadegh had passed a bill against Soviet influence in Iran. The communists called him a stooge of the Americans. They said he was fighting against the British and the Soviets in favor of the Americans. The communists had even infiltrated the Iranian army and started an underground military organization. Mohammad Ali Amoui was a communist sympathizer before he joined the army.
تجربه نشون داده بود که کارهای مخفی حزب احتیاج به سپر حفاظتی داره و هیچ نیرویی بهتر از نظامی ها نمیتونه این کار انجام ده. اولا این پوشش ویژهشون، ثانیاً حضورشون در رکن 2 و شهربانی و کلانتری ها و اینجاها. این یک وجه قضیه هست که از لحاظ اطلاعات و خطرات و این چیزها، این که آیا در درون حزب نفوذی شده یا نه.
After the Second World War, many oil-producing nations agreed on a 50-50 share of profits with the American oil company. Before nationalizing its oil, Iran had asked for the same deal with the British, but they had rejected Iran's requests. The company's uncompromising stance even angered some British diplomats.
British government should have said to the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, as soon as the Americans had made the agreement, we obviously must make a 50-50 agreement with Iran. It was so obvious to anybody but a bloody stupid idiot who ran the Anglo-Iranian.
Mossadegh was part of a generation of Third World politicians who hoped that America would be a partner in their struggle against the old colonial powers. American President Harry S. Truman had openly criticized British colonialist policies.
Well, the United States after World War II saw itself in some ways as a supporter of independence and post-colonial sovereignty in the Third World, partly for philosophical, moral reasons, but also partly for practical reasons, because they believed that British intransigence on the issue of independence for third world nations was going to play into the hands of the Soviets.
In July 1951, Truman sent his representative to Iran.
W. Averill Harriman, U.S. envoy at large, is greeted by Ambassador Grady as he arrives in Tehran to attempt arbitration in the explosive oil nationalization crisis. He will seek to reconcile views of the British interests and Iranian nationalists.
The British were demanding very exorbitant compensation, and the U.S. was continually trying to get them to reduce their demands of this sort. So the U.S. was playing a relatively even-handed role. It was the British who were being very recalcitrant.
American rhetoric led Mossadegh to believe that they would help him against the British. He was surprised that Harriman's visit didn't come to any conclusion. Britain was a strategic ally of the United States, and throughout his negotiations, Harriman expressed his support for the British boycott of Iran.
Despite the cordial reception given Mr. Harriman by government officials, his arrival is the signal for demonstrations by communist-inspired members of the Tudeh National Party. Right and left groups clash. The conflict, which starts in Parliament Square, requires strenuous efforts on the part of mounted police before it is quelled.
Harriman's visit worked against Mossadegh. After returning to Washington, Harriman's main concern was that Mossadegh could not withstand a Soviet takeover.
A demonstration by a party outlawed in Iran.
In October 1951, Mossadegh went to New York to defend Iran's case against the British at the United Nations in New York. In Washington, Mossadegh received a warm welcome from Truman. The Americans showered him with praise as a genuine nationalist politician. But while the Americans supported Mossadegh publicly, in private they called his stance against the British stubborn and inflexible.
میگفتند که امریکایی‌ها خیلی ساده هستند و هیچ چیزی پیله‌ای تو کارشون نیست و بیشتر تحت نفوذ انگلیس‌ها هستند که اگر کاری هم که بعداً کردند و اینها بیشتر میگن تحت نفوذ انگلیس‌ها بودن که این کارا رو کردن. خودشون آدمای خیلی چیزی بودن. میگه آدمای با انصافی بودن رو هم رفته. ایشون یه همچین برداشتی داشت.
Mossadegh never understood that Truman was not really able to help him. Truman, who was a Democrat, was being challenged by the Republicans, who had not been in the White House for 20 years. The Republicans' main line of attack was that Truman's government was too soft on communists in America and worldwide. The Republicans' attack was spearheaded by Senator Joseph McCarthy.
And even if there were only one communist in the State Department, even if there were only one communist in the State Department, that would still be one communist too many.
Since becoming Prime Minister, Mossadegh had an uneasy relationship with Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the King of Iran. Mossadegh thought the Shah should only be a symbol of the country's unity and not the ruler. This effectively meant curbing the power of the king and the royal court. So the Shah's allies, who were losing their influence, started to conspire against Mossadegh. Asadollah Rashidian was one of the most important supporters of the Shah and a well-known British sympathizer. Much of Rashidian's influence came from his contacts with Tehran's hoodlums, thugs who usually gathered in traditional wrestling clubs known as zurkhanas, or houses of power. Abbas Ramazani was a sidekick of the famous gang leader Tayyib. Leaders like Tayyib had a huge influence on Iranian politics.
یارو میامد رئیس ها میدید یه حق حساب میداشت
رئیس لاتا رو میده
آره هر کسی دست میخواست نخواست وزیر بشه میخواست رای بیاره میرم سوار ماشین میشد 15 رو میدید مایه میداد وقتی همه آمدن حاضرن نعره میکشن میان
Rashidian and other British agents and allies used all their resources to defeat Mossadegh and boost the power of the Shah. But the young monarch was inexperienced and indecisive, virtually imprisoned in his palace with his wife and a variety of pets. The Shah's weakness angered Rashidian and his patrons at the British embassy. In a conversation with Sam Fall, Rashidian expressed his frustration with the Shah by using a particularly Persian derogatory term.
Pedasuchte.
Why did they call him Pedasuchte?
They called him Pedasuchte because he was a coward. خیلی میترسه. خیلی.
Mossadegh was a secular politician who believed in the separation of religion and politics. He would never have been able to mobilize the majority of Iranians, who were religious and traditional, without the help of Ayatollah Kashani, a popular religious leader. Ayatollah Kashani rallied thousands of ordinary Iranians and told them that it was their religious duty to support the nationalization movement.
افکار و اندیشه آیت الله کاشانی از حکومت اسلامی این بود که باید حاکمیت ملی در اختیار مردم ایران قرار بگیره. بیگانگان بر کشور مسلط نباشند. و از طرفی باید موازین اخلاقی انسانی در جامعه برپا بشه.
At the time, Kashani was one of the very few Ayatollahs who mixed religion with politics. Most clerics did not support Kashani's political interpretation of Islam. The mainstream mullahs tried to stay out of politics and have a peaceful coexistence with the monarch and his government. The clergy regarded the monarch as the protector of the religious establishment. In turn, they were supported by the Iranian royalty. Many supporters of the Shah, especially in the army, believed that Mossadegh was planning to abolish the monarchy and establish a republic, with himself as its president. In July 1951, Mossadegh realized that a group of officers were plotting a coup against him.
و توطئه بعد از این بود که ستاد ارتش و فرماندهان لشکر ابلاغ بکنه که به طرفدار شاه قیام بکنید و دکتر مصدق را در حقیقت با یک کودتای به شکل توطئه سقوطش بدن و از بین ببرن. این خیلی امر مسلم.
In accordance with Iranian law, Mossadegh asked the Shah to allow him to take over the Ministry of Defense.
شاه به شدت با این مخالفت کرد. مصدق گفت من یا این کار رو شما موافقت میکنین، اگه نکنین من دیگه معذورم. این بود که شاه گفت نه موافقت نمیکنیم و مصدق استعفا داد.
After Mossadegh resigned, the Shah chose Ahmad Qavam, one of the most experienced Iranian politicians, as prime minister. Qavam had called Mossadegh's inflexible stance during oil negotiations disastrous and called for a more diplomatic solution to the oil crisis. Qavam particularly opposed the interference of Ayatollah Kashani and other religious leaders in the affairs of the state. Ayatollah Kashani called Qavam an infidel and asked his own supporters to take to the streets in protest.
این دوره مصدق خیلی حضور نداشت تو جامعه. کاشانی خیلی کار کرد. فضای جامعه رو خیلی خیلی داغ کرد.
Ayatollah Kashani gave an ultimatum to the Shah: bring back Mossadegh to power or I will revolt against you. On the 21st of July 1952, Kashani and Mossadegh's supporters revolted against Qavam and the Shah. Mossadegh came back to power a few days later. The 21st of July transformed Iranian politics. The people, or what the British ambassador called the mob, demonstrated their power to change the existing order.
The events of the 21st of July may well prove a turning point in Persian history. The mob successfully defied the security forces, and from now on, the consent of the mob will be the decisive factor in judging the acceptability of any future government.
The 21st of July uprising showed that Mossadegh's survival depended on Ayatollah Khashoggi's support, but soon the Ayatollah turned against Mossadegh. The main reason for the split had to do with their family and close associates. Each of their followers wanted to gain more power in the government.
آیت الله کاشانی بعد از خودش را چون سهیم می‌دانست در قیام سی تیر داعیه دخالت در حکومت هم داشت. آقای دکتر مصدق به هیچ وجه امکان نمیداد که آیت الله کاشانی در حکومت دخالت کنه.
Ayatollah Khashoggi objected to Mossadegh's choice of non-religious cabinet ministers, and his supporters accused Mossadegh of acting on behalf of foreign powers.
انگلیس ها روی او سرمایه گذاری کرده بودند و نمیخواستن او در واقع مجری منویات نهاییشون باشه. ولی از او به عنوان یک کاتالیزور، از او به عنوان یک واسطه میخواستن استفاده کنن که ابتدا این نهضت رو به شکست بکشونه، اتحاد مردم رو به پراکندگی تبدیل کنه و وقتی جامعه در واقع بی‌دفاع شد افرادی رو بالاخره میذاشتن در سر قدرت و مقاصد خودشون رو به مورد اجرا میگذاشتن.
While Mossadegh's allies withdrew their support, the communists adopted a more friendly view of him and his government.
ما بعد از 30 تیر 31 وفادارترین نیروی هوادار دکتر مصدق بودیم. نزدیکترین یاران مصدق در لحظات حساس رهاش کردند و این حزب توده ایران بود که مرتب از طریق جمعیت ملی مبارزه با استعمار نشست‌هایی داشت با مصدق و برخی از اعضای کابینش.
Mossadegh's supporters claimed that he had his own reasons for not suppressing the communists, reasons which he didn't share with many people.
فلسفه‌اش که نگه داشته بود این بود که به امریکایی‌ها و انگلیس بگه که اگر من در قضیه ملی شدن صنعت نفت شکست بخورم مردم رو خواهند آورد به حزب توده و روسا مردم. اون وقت پای روس وقتی حزب توده حاکم شد پای روس هم کشونده میشه به ایران و تا میرن تا خلیج فارس. این را معذرت میخوام عوامانه بگم یه لولو درست کرده بود در مقابل امریکا و انگلیس.
Mossadegh had miscalculated. For the Americans, he became a liability rather than an ally.
The real fear that U.S. officials had at this time was that communist parties in many parts of the world were using what were called popular front tactics, in which they would join coalitions with non-communist forces and then gradually push out the non-communists and seize power in this kind of very insidious way.
In the fall of 1952, the British intensified their covert actions to topple Mossadegh. Sam Fall thought General Fazlollah Zahedi to be the best substitute. General Zahedi was popular in the army and had contacts with businessmen and the clergy. In his recommendation note about Zahedi, Sam Fall wrote,
"In this country of weak men, he is comparatively strong. He is strongly anti-communist. He is on good terms with some members of the National Front. Among these is Khashoggi."
Zahedi was my idea because he was tough, ruthless, military, and a respectable member of the establishment.
In October 1952, Mossadegh discovered the plot and cut all diplomatic ties with Britain.
Do you think the Mossadegh did the right thing by closing the embassy of a country that was interfering in the affairs of his country?
Yes, I think he did. I think he had reason. I think it was quite justly we were closed, and it was done nicely without killing anybody.
A few weeks after the embassy's closure, Sam Fall and the MI6 chief in Iran went to Washington. Their mission was to convince the Americans that Mossadegh should be deposed through a military coup. When Fall visited Washington in November 1952, the Republican candidate, Dwight D. Eisenhower, had already been elected. Eisenhower became president in January 1953. Two brothers led the Eisenhower administration's foreign policy: Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and the director of the CIA, Allen Dulles.
Dulles brothers were very anxious to begin using covert action in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. And at the same time, the Soviet Union, of course, its KGB, was using covert action extensively throughout Europe and elsewhere in the world. So there was the feeling, especially among Republicans in the United States, that we had to increase our use of covert action because the Soviets were doing this extensively.
After the sudden death of Joseph Stalin in March 1953, the Soviet Union's foreign policy was in disarray. While the Iranian communists were in mourning at the Russian embassy, the Americans intensified their anti-Mossadegh and anti-communist campaign. On the 4th of April 1953, $1 million was sent to the CIA station in Tehran. By then, the agency had 130 Iranians on its payroll. Phase 1 of the operation to overthrow Mossadegh was black propaganda, which included planting anti-Mossadegh articles in Iranian newspapers.
Some of the materials were prepared outside of Iran and brought into the country. Other materials were written on the spot. The agency would bribe local journalists to write articles. They would find other ways to plant stories.
CIA operatives also acted in the guise of communists to provoke religious Iranians. They printed anti-Islamic leaflets in which they threatened Muslim clerics.
مبنی بر این که ما به زودی شماها رو با عمامه هاتون حلق‌آویز خواهیم کرد. خب واقعیتش این هست که توی توده مردم این اثر میذاره.
Since the boycott of Iran's oil, Iranians were getting poorer every day. Ordinary Iranians were getting tired of political infighting and instability. Ayatollah Kashani and his allies in the parliament were doing their best to bring down Mossadegh. After a 2-year international embargo of Iran's oil, Mossadegh's government was virtually bankrupt. In May 1953, Mossadegh wrote a private letter to Eisenhower. He warned the American president that the communists would take over if the Americans didn't help him financially. Eisenhower ignored Mossadegh's letter for 1 month and then rejected the request. The CIA circulated Mossadegh's letter and Eisenhower's reply. Mossadegh was publicly humiliated. By August 1953, his government was on the verge of collapse. Operation TP Ajax was led by the head of CIA covert operations in the Middle East, Kermit Roosevelt. TP was the prefix referring to the CIA's operations in Iran. Kermit Roosevelt wasted no time in planning the coup. Like the British, he thought General Zahedi should become Prime Minister after the fall of Mossadegh. The coup was to be carried out on the 15th of August 1953. Even as they were planning to depose him, the CIA thought highly of Mossadegh.
Now, there were quirks in his personality that did not sit well with Americans. They didn't really understand some of his, his patterns of behavior. But in terms of his integrity, in terms of his intelligence, his capacities as a statesman, there was a near unanimous feeling that he was a remarkable man.
The CIA had a lower opinion of the Shah, but they needed him to make the coup seem like a legitimate Iranian uprising. The Shah was reluctant to sign two edicts. One was to dismiss Mossadegh, and the other to appoint Zahedi as the new prime minister. So the CIA and Asadollah Rashidian recruited the Shah's twin sister, Princess Ashraf, to convince him to sign the edicts. But the Shah was still suspicious of Roosevelt and his team. BBC World Service Radio helped Roosevelt to prove his credentials to the Shah. According to CIA documents, Roosevelt arranged for the BBC to change their standard wording, "It is now midnight," to "It is now exactly midnight," a sign that proved to the monarch that the British and American governments were behind the coup. The Shah is still not convinced. He leaves with his wife to a resort on the Caspian Sea. Roosevelt sends Colonel Nassiri, the commander of the Royal Guard, to get the Shah's signature. Before Nassiri's return to Tehran, Mossadegh's bodyguard, Musa Mehran, has already learned about the coup from a communist army officer.
حدود ساعت 8 شب بود و به ایشون عرض کردم که به احتمال قوی امشب به ما حمله خواهد شد و شما مطلع باشید و چون تانک میاد و ما هم تانک داریم ممکنه سر صدا باشه وحشت نکنید.
When Nassiri arrives at the Prime Minister's house, he is arrested. Several other army officers involved in the coup are imprisoned on Mossadegh's orders. General Zahedi has escaped and is in hiding. The 15th of August CIA coup has failed. Kermit Roosevelt and other CIA officers hear about the failure of Operation Ajax from their Iranian informers. They hole themselves up in the embassy, but they know that Mossadegh has a weak grip on power. The Americans immediately start to plan their next move. Iranians learn about the failed coup in the morning. Pro-Mossadegh army units are deployed throughout Tehran. The Shah and the Queen leave their Caspian resort for Iraq and then Italy. In Iraq, the Shah tells the American ambassador that he would be looking for work and that he has a large family and very small means outside his country. The communists take to the streets and bring down the statues of the Shah. They practically rule Tehran and crush those who opposed them. They ask Mossadegh's supporters to join them.
پیشنهاد به مصدق بود که ملیون رو دعوت کنید بیان به میدان و در این صورت اگر بیان به میدان ما موفق خواهیم شد، همونطور که در 3 تیر توانستیم، همونطور که در 25 مرداد توانستیم. اگر این کار انجام بگیره ما کودتا رو حتما سرکوب میکنیم، جلوشو میگیریم.
On the 21st of July the previous year, Ayatollah Kashani and his supporters brought Mossadegh back to power. This time they choose to stay at home. The CIA tries to pass $10,000 to the Ayatollah. No one knows what happens to the money. Ayatollah Kashani's family later claim that he warned Mossadegh about the coup. According to CIA documents, since the failure of the coup, the communists and CIA operatives pretending to be communists disturb ordinary Iranians and break shop windows.
تمام این مغازه‌هایی که من حرکت کردم و دیدم شروع می‌کردن به اینکه کیکرهاشون رو پایین بکشن، کیکرهاشون میشن بالا. در حقیقت یک تزلزل و ناامنی در طبقه تاجر و کاسب و مغازه‌دار تهران ایجاد شد.
In a rally in central Tehran, Mossadegh's supporters ask the Shah to abdicate. Mossadegh, whose duty as prime minister is to defend the monarchy, does not denounce his supporters. The communists and CIA operatives pretending to be communists continue to demolish the statues of the Shah. Ordinary Iranians stay home, worried about a communist takeover.
این نگرانی بر مردم به وجود اومده بود که اینها اون نیروی غالب اینها خواهند بود که در عمق وجدان ملت ایران به حق یا به ناحق که به حقم بود این بود که این حزب وابستگی به شوروی داره و نمیتونستن تحمل کنن.
Discouraged by the failure of the first attempt to stage a coup, the CIA orders its officers to halt Operation Ajax. But Roosevelt knows about the mood on the streets and has his own plans.
We got the cable from Washington telling him to pull out and to get all personnel out of the country because things were falling apart. And Roosevelt essentially tore up the cable, threw it in the trash, and said words to the effect of, "I didn't see that."
Inspired by the Iranians' resentment of the communists, Roosevelt and General Zahedi give orders to army officers from their hideouts to prepare for another coup. Most senior officers remain loyal to the Shah. They deplore Mossadegh and hate the idea of an Iranian republic. They get ready to act again. Mobs pretending to be communists start to attack Americans. The American ambassador, Loy Henderson, meets Mossadegh and tells him that he is concerned about the safety of American citizens in Iran, and that if Mossadegh can't guarantee their security, he will ask all Americans to leave the country.
اینجا مصدق یه مماشات عجیبی کرد. یعنی تهدید هندرسون کار خودشو کرد. هیچ چیزی بهتر از این نیست که برای کودتا خیابانا خلوت بشه. به راحتی جابجایی نیروها میکنن و هیچ نیرویی نیست که مقابله بکنه.
Mossadegh asks his chief of police to break up the demonstrations. Communists are rounded up on the streets and incarcerated. They have been Mossadegh's most active supporters in the last 3 days. Many people believe that Mossadegh was also worried about a communist takeover.
عصر 27 مرداد به علت دستوری که آقای دکتر مصدق به فرماندار نظامی داد 600 نفر کادرهای حزب توده ایران بازداشت شدند. ببینید برای حزب غیرقانونی زیرزمینی بازداشت 600 نفر چه مصیبتی برای ارتباطات مخفی حزب به وجود میاره.
On the night of the 18th of August 1953, Tehran is quiet. Under Kermit Roosevelt's command, Iranian operatives organize anti-Mossadegh mobs to take over the streets of Tehran and other cities. General Zahedi orders the army to take over key positions. The army and an angry mob start attacking Mossadegh's house. Mossadegh does not resist.
تمام دیوارهای اتاق آقای دکتر مصدق گلوله بهش خورده بود. من میخورد و صدای مهیب میکرد تا یکی از گلوله ها وارد اتاق میشه. یه گلوله رسام از تانک میخوره گلوله. آقای دکتر مصدق حرکت نمیکنه. آقای دکتر صدیقی بگه که اجازه بدید بریم از اتاق بیرون، اینجا نه، تخت من از اینجا بردارید بذارید اون.
On the 19th of August 1953, General Zahedi becomes the Prime Minister of Iran. His officers take over Tehran radio. Mossadegh escapes from his house on a ladder. The day after the coup, he surrenders himself to the army.
Former Premier Mossadegh's ruined house is a mute testimony to 3 days of bloody rioting, culminating in a military coup from which the one-time dictator of Iran fled for his life. The Shah, who had fled to Rome, comes home, backed by General Zahedi, military strongman, who engineered his return to power. Iranian oil may again flow westward.
In a private ceremony, the Shah thanked the leaders of the hoodlums for their valor. The Shah designated the 19th of August as the day of the uprising of the Shah and the nation. To this day, Zahedi's supporters and his family deny any connection with foreign governments. They claim Kermit Roosevelt and Sam Fall are liars, and that the CIA and British documents are fabricated. Sir Sam Fall never returned to Iran. He enjoyed a successful career in the Foreign Office. He still insists that his operatives were patriotic Iranians.
How would you describe someone who advocates British policies and receives money from the British Embassy for advocating those policies?
Well, I suppose the Iranians would call him a British stooge.
What do you call them?
I would call them a sensible cooperator.
Thousands of communists were arrested or killed after the coup. Mohammad Ali Amoui spent 25 years in jail. The CIA repeated its success in many other countries. After the 1953 coup in Iran, the agency changed the governments in Guatemala in 1954, Congo in 1960, and Chile in 1973. The United States became the main ally of the Shah for the rest of his reign. The day after the coup, Ayatollah Kashani visited Mossadegh's destroyed house. The nationalization movement and the 21st of July uprising proved that Islam was the strongest political force in Iran. Mossadegh, and later the Shah, paid the price for ignoring clerical power. Ayatollah Kashani died in 1962. Around the same time, one of his supporters, Ayatollah Khomeini, started a movement which led to the 1979 Islamic Revolution. To many Iranians, the 1979 revolution was a direct result of the 1953 coup. Mossadegh was put on trial a few months after the coup. During his trial, he called himself the legal Prime Minister of Iran. He never recognized the legitimacy of the court. He said that the only reason for which he was being tried was for cutting the hands of the British from Iran. Mossadegh was sentenced to 3 years solitary confinement. He was released in 1956. He spent the rest of his life under house arrest at his home near Tehran.
اصولا ایشون خیلی که به اهدافش نرسید و اون کارهایی که میخواست بکنه نتونست اونجور که میخواست انجام بده و اینا خیلی 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 مایوس بود.
In 1954, a consortium of American and European oil companies signed an agreement with Iran to explore and sell its oil. But Iranian oil has largely remained in Iranian hands. That was Mohammad Mossadegh's most important achievement. Mossadegh has become a legend whose name is synonymous with Iranian independence.